A polar bear was once found gnawing on the rudder of a United States nuclear submarine after it surfaced through Arctic ice. That is the world these sailors operate in. Right now, somewhere under 6 feet of frozen ocean, 130 Americans are doing their jobs like it is a Tuesday. Under the Arctic ice, the rules of survival are written in meters and minutes. The surface may look like a silent, endless white plain, but underneath, the ice is shaped into a jagged maze. Most of the pack is 3.5 meters thick, just over 11 feet, but that is only the average. Ridges pile up into underwater cliffs called keels, and these can plunge more than 45 meters down into the black, freezing water. For a submarine with a draft of 5 meters, that means the margin for error is razor thin. The hull passes beneath these ice keels with less clearance than a city bus under a highway overpass. There's no such thing as a guaranteed way out. If a submarine misjudges the ice above, it can find itself boxed in by a field of keels. No leads, no gaps, no polynyas. A polynya is a rare phenomenon, a patch of open water surrounded by solid ice, sometimes only a few meters wide, sometimes stretching for kilometers if the wind and currents allow. These are the only natural exits for a submarine, and without one, the crew faces a no-exit scenario. The only option left is to force a way up, using high-pressure air to blow the ballast tanks and ram the hull against the ice. That maneuver is as violent as it sounds. The hull shudders, the steel flexes, and the entire submarine braces for impact. Even then, if the ice overhead is too thick or a hidden keel blocks the way, the vessel may not break through. NATO's Arctic Manual lays out the numbers in black and white. In winter, the average thickness is 3.5 meters, but keels exceeding 45 meters are not rare. Some regions, like the Beaufort and Chukchi Seas, see keels even deeper. About 12% of the ice field presents drafts greater than 3 meters, and 3% exceeds 5 meters, enough to block a standard submarine from reaching the surface at all. The crew's only insurance is constant vigilance, sonar pings, satellite maps, and a running calculation of risk. No sunlight reaches the control room. There is no fresh air, no escape hatch to the sky. Every decision is made with the knowledge that the ice above may be impassable. The phrase, "no emergency exit," is not a figure of speech. It is a literal warning etched into every patrol briefing. If the boat is trapped beneath a continuous field of keels, the only way out is to wait, hope for a polynya to open, or risk the dangerous ascent. The Arctic does not forgive mistakes. It offers no second chances. For the 130 sailors sealed inside a steel tube, the ice overhead is both a shield and a prison, one that demands absolute respect and constant adaptation. On August 3, 1958, USS Nautilus became the first submarine to reach the geographic North Pole, carrying 116 crew and 5 civilian scientists. The moment was historic, but life inside the hull was anything but ceremonial. Nautilus's journey under the ice was a daily negotiation with the unknown. Crew members shared bunks in tightly regimented shifts, with 3 sailors to each bed, hot racking their way through a 6-hour watch and a 12-hour off cycle. The air was thick with the scent of metal and boiled beans, a detail that lingers in letters and memoirs from that summer. The galley, stocked with canned meats and powdered eggs, became the ship's unofficial heart. Aboard Nautilus, the best food in the fleet was not a boast but a deliberate tactic, a way to preserve morale when every other comfort had been stripped away by the ice overhead. The hazards were constant. On the first day beneath the polar cap, the periscopes were crushed by shifting ice, forcing the crew to abandon visual checks and rely entirely on sonar. That pivot, documented in Captain William R. Anderson's after-action report, changed Arctic submarine doctrine overnight. Sonar, not sight, became the only reliable guide through the maze of keels and ridges. Nautilus's hull scraped a hidden ridge in the Chukchi Sea, triggering alarms and a tense emergency drill. The hull flexed, the metal complained, but the boat held. In the days that followed, the crew learned to read the subtle language of sonar echoes, distinguishing between a safe lead and a squeeze that could trap them for good. The psychological strain was measured not in dramatic breakdowns, but in small, cumulative ways. Sleep averaged just over 4 hours per sailor per day. The absence of daylight blurred the boundaries between morning and midnight. Medical logs from the voyage note mild hypothermia in several crew, and a spike in cortisol levels, early evidence that living under the ice is as much a mental challenge as a physical one. The Navy responded by formalizing resilience training and mandating higher compartment temperatures for all future Arctic missions. One retired sailor, now in his 80s, remembers the moment Nautilus surfaced through a narrow lead at the pole. Sunlight spilled through a 30-centimeter opening in the ice, dazzling after days of artificial light. The crew erupted into an impromptu chant that later generations would call the pole song. That fleeting exposure to daylight became a psychological anchor, referenced in oral histories and echoed by every submariner who has since earned the title Blue Nose. 7 months after Nautilus, USS Skate surfaced at the pole on March 17, 1959, breaking through 3 meters of ice. Skate's crew, about 130 strong, proved that a submarine could not only survive but operate for weeks at a time beneath the Arctic cap. The lessons from Nautilus and Skate became the backbone of modern Arctic submarine doctrine: trust in sonar, discipline in routines, and the knowledge that human endurance is as vital as steel or reactor power. The term Blue Nose, once a tongue-in-cheek label for rigid rule followers, became a badge of quiet pride, marking those who had seen the sun rise through a hole in the ice and lived to tell the story. Inside the hull, the world narrows to a soundscape that most people will never hear. Above, the ice cap muffles the chaos of the open ocean. No crashing waves, no engine noise from distant ships, no whale songs echoing through the deep. Instead, the submarine moves through a silence so complete that it registers under 50 decibels, quieter than a library at midnight. For the sonar operators, this is both a gift and a curse. Every ping, every echo, every faint vibration carries meaning. The upward-looking sonar, ULS, becomes their window to the world above. Operating at 12 kilohertz, the system sends a narrow beam upward, mapping the ice overhead in 1-meter slices. Each ping returns a cross-section. A sudden spike in distance means a keel. A flat line might signal a rare polynya, a possible way out. The data scrolls by in real time, and the operators learn to read it like a language. Training is relentless. New sonar techs spend 4 days immersed in recordings, keels, ridges, open leads, until they can spot the difference between a safe passage and a trap by ear alone. The manuals are filled with spectral plots and acoustic signatures, but the real test comes in the control room, where a single misread echo could mean the difference between surfacing and staying sealed under ice. One former sonar operator, now retired, remembers the first time he heard the ice above the hull crack from thermal stress. It started as a low groan, then rose into a high-pitched wail, so eerie and sharp that the crew called it the baby cry. The sound lasted just a few seconds, but it left everyone wide awake and wondering if the ice was about to give way. These moments are rare, logged in acoustic anomaly reports, but they linger in memory long after the patrol ends. Most of the time, the silence is broken only by the submarine itself. When the control surfaces or sail brush against a hidden keel, the hull emits a grinding tone, 30 to 45 hertz, a mechanical groan that vibrates through every compartment. The crew feels it in their teeth, a reminder that the ice above is never far away. Sonar operators are trained to separate these internal noises from external threats, filtering out the familiar to catch the unexpected. The skill is part science, part intuition, and it grows sharper with every patrol. The sensory deprivation under the ice is profound. Sonar techs describe the silence as both peaceful and unsettling. In the open ocean, the constant background noise masks fatigue. Under the cap, the quiet amplifies every small sound: the drip of condensation, the click of a switch, the soft hum of the reactor. Over weeks, the mind begins to play tricks, inventing patterns in the static or imagining footsteps that are not there. Fatigue creeps in, subtle and persistent, wearing at the edges of concentration. The Navy's training curriculum addresses this directly, building routines and cross-checks into every watch. No one is left alone with the sonar for too long. Navigating beneath the Arctic ice is an act of technical mastery, but also of adaptation. The crew learns to trust the ULS, to interpret its 1-meter profiles as a living map, and to accept that silence is not safety, it is simply the baseline for survival. The sounds of the ice, the grind of the hull, the rare, inexplicable cries in the night, these become the soundtrack of life under the cap. For the 130 sailors inside, the absence of noise is a constant reminder of where they are, sealed beneath a frozen ceiling, listening for the world above to change. Choice disappears fast beneath the Arctic. Every meal for 70 days is mapped out before the submarine leaves port. 15,000 pounds of food packed tight must last 130 sailors with zero resupply. SkySec's provisioning logs read like a blueprint for survival. Crates of canned beef, sacks of flour, powdered eggs, all squeezed through the hatch and stacked in every available space. The galley, wedged between the reactor and torpedo room, is smaller than most kitchens but runs around the clock. 3 shifts, 24 hours a day. Every 6 hours, a new watch comes off duty, hungry and dazed, counting on something hot and familiar. The menu is built for endurance. 3,000 calories per sailor, split between protein, carbs, and fat. For the first 14 days, there is fresh fruit, milk, and the rare treat of lettuce. After that, the diet contracts frozen chicken, shelf-stable cheese, and the ever-present scent of reconstituted mashed potatoes. The last apple is a quiet event, sometimes marked with a mock ceremony, a culinary sunset logged in the galley book. The Navy's rule is simple: submarines get the best food in the fleet, not out of kindness, but necessity. Under the ice, with no sun, no wind, and no escape, good meals are the main defense against monotony and tension. The chief cook, usually a petty officer with a sharp memory and a knack for improvising, knows the stakes. There's a saying in the mess: morale rides on a tray, burn the eggs and you'll hear about it from the captain. The galley's rhythm never lets up. Breakfast for the oncoming watch might be steak and eggs at midnight, pancakes at noon, or chili with cornbread when the body's clock has lost all sense of time. Cooks learn to anticipate cravings before anyone speaks. On Sundays, if time allows, there might be pizza dough-proofed in a steel bowl, sauce from a can, and cheese rationed like gold. Not gourmet, but under the ice, it tastes like a feast. Each meal is a small act of defiance against sameness. The galley whiteboard lists birthdays and the days until surfacing. When a patrol crosses halfway, the cooks might break out emergency chocolate or bake a cake from scratch using powdered eggs and whatever can be spared. These moments linger long after the patrol ends. One chief cook, after a SkySec's cruise, recalled inventing Arctic lasagna, freeze-dried beef, shelf-stable cheese, noodles boiled in reactor-heated water. The crew still talks about it, not because it was the best meal, but because it was different, and different is priceless under the ice. Logistics are unforgiving. If a refrigeration unit fails, as it did on a Los Angeles-class boat in 2006, the cooks switch to powdered soups and ration what is left. No one complains, the system absorbs setbacks. 3 hot meals a day, snacks always available, and coffee brewed strong enough to stand a spoon upright. The galley never closes. Even at midnight, the smell of baking bread drifts through the vents, a reminder that, for now, the world is still turning. Food here is more than fuel. It is the anchor that keeps 130 people steady when the ice above is thick and the days blur. The chief cook's quiet authority, the mess crew's banter, the ritual of sitting down to eat, these are the bonds that hold the crew together. Survival is measured not just in meters and minutes, but in meals shared and routines kept. The next challenge, sleep, waits just beyond the galley door. Sleep on a submarine is a matter of rotation, not rest. With only 65 bunks for 130 crew, 3 sailors share each rack, cycling through in shifts. Hot racking means sliding into a bed still warm from the last person, never truly your own. As one junior sailor put it, you do not own a bed, you rent it by the hour. The schedule is fixed, 6 hours on watch, 12 hours off, repeated until days blur, and the only measure of time is the next wake-up knock on metal. In the torpedo room, the so-called bridal suite, a rare double bunk tucked behind racks of warheads, offers a little more space and quiet, but most squeeze into narrow slots wedged between pipes and machinery, the air thick with laundry and oil. Navy sleep studies found submariners average 4 to 5 hours of sleep a day, with a measured efficiency of 78%. It is just enough to keep the crew sharp beneath the ice. There is no sunrise or sunset, only artificial cycles, white light for waking, dim red for sleeping, and in recent years, blue light therapy in quiet rooms. Blue light is not for comfort, it is for biology, helping reset circadian rhythms. Trials showed sailors exposed to blue light had 30% fewer sleep disruptions. Still, time slips away, replaced by the steady rhythm of watch, sleep, eat, repeat. Selection for Arctic submarine patrol starts long before a sailor boards. Out of every 100 applicants, 12 are quietly turned away, not for lack of skill, but because psychological screening finds them unsuited for months of isolation and darkness. The Navy's tests, from the MMPI-2 to operational stress interviews, look for people who can handle discomfort. Once underway, the odds of someone being removed for mental health reasons, panic, anxiety, or adjustment disorder drop to less than 0.5%. Most who pass the gate stay on patrol, a result behavioral health officers attribute to both the rigorous selection and the routines built into submarine life. Resilience is not left to chance. Each week, the medical officer checks in with every sailor, but the real buffer is tradition. Field Day, a weekly ritual, brings the crew together for a deep clean, music playing as everyone scrubs side by side. It is part hygiene, part therapy, and psychologists see it as a pressure valve, a way to reset nerves and reinforce unity. Identity, under the ice, is its own currency. Blue Nose is reserved for those who have surfaced through Arctic ice, a badge earned, never given. Newcomers are called warm bodies, a gentle nudge about what lies ahead. Pride in being Blue Nose runs deep, surfacing in jokes and stories. The Navy's retention numbers tell the rest. 71% of submariners re-enlist, compared to just over half on surface ships. Shared hardship and Blue Nose pride do not just help sailors endure, they make many want to return. Somewhere right now, 130 people are splitting 6-hour sleep cycles, eating meals planned to the ounce, and navigating 45-meter ice keels just to keep a silent promise beneath the Arctic. In a world obsessed with comfort, their routines make ordinary life feel extravagant by comparison. The ice ceiling above them never softens, neither does the discipline below. Drop your perspective below. What would you miss most in their world?